Professor Bianca Brijnath has her disciplinary training in medical anthropology and public health, and her research expertise is in cultural diversity, dementia, and mental health. We have had the privilege of having Bianca as a guest on our podcast as well and on previous webinars, and she's well versed in this topic. So within these disciplinary and contextual boundaries, she has undertaken several studies on dementia prevention awareness, diagnosis and care specific to culturally diverse communities in Australia and internationally. In recognition of her research, she was inducted into the State Government of Victoria's Multicultural Honour Roll in 2022. Thank you, Bianca, for being with us again, and looking forward to your presentation.
I'm a big fan of the Centre and the BGAC Alliance and the amazing work that they do around the country. And I'm very delighted to be able to talk about this topic, although it is a sensitive topic and not an easy one to navigate. In the short amount of time that I've been allocated today, I just will I guess provide a bit of a context and an overview of racism and sort of how it's situated in Australia more broadly, and then how it fits within the kind of aged care context. And I'll provide a couple of solutions of what individuals can do in their kind of professional capacity. So I will start, I guess, by distinguishing between ethnicity and race, because the two are often put together, but they're not the same thing. Although when we talk about racism, it also is about discrimination and prejudice towards people from different ethnic backgrounds as well. So ethnicity is really in many ways a sense of shared personhood or descent based on various factors such as national origin, your country of birth, perhaps the language you speak, the religious beliefs you hold, and it could be self-identified or attributed by others. The concept is very dynamic and changing. It's not something that is sort of ossified and never to be moving. Everybody's got an ethnicity, but very often majority groups in a particular country may not see themselves as being ethnic, even though, of course, we all have an ethnicity. Race is a little bit different, and race is a very controversial concept, and because it sort of operates at three levels: as a classification, a signifier, and a synonym. Now, as a classification, it was a very common thing to do really at the turn of the 20th century, when you had ideas of phenomenology and biology and racist biology. And it was sort of the basis on which human people were classified into different categories and ranked really on visible physical characteristics, and often a particular skin color, in this case white, was privileged and thought to be very superior, and then other communities and colors were thought to be inferior, and all sorts of attributes falsely and wrongly attributed to these communities. The concept of race as a classification has been widely discredited. There is absolutely no scientific evidence for it at all. And similarly, race as a signifier refers to sort of social practices on the basis of physical markings that are again falsely imputed to particular groups, and certain behaviors again imputed to them. Now, race as a synonym is probably more accurate, where it really refers to that intersection between identity, history, trauma, and structural racism coming together there more as a sociological concept rather than a physiological or biological one. So it's important to keep that distinction. There is a very big push, actually, in scientific discourse to do away with the term race altogether. Because it's so mired in a problematic history and it's got such little evidence underpinning it. But I think until we get some major shifts in some of the sort of scientific landscape globally, the term is likely to stay around at least for the next 10 years, unfortunately. Now, while race as a concept is highly contested and a big push to do away with it altogether, racism as a concept, unfortunately, is all too prevalent, very commonly understood. And it is a social problem that is very much real and felt around the world. And it really refers to a conglomeration of systems, policies, actions, and attitudes that serve to create unequal opportunities for people based on uh, a perceived physiological difference. Now, I really want to emphasize in this talk, when I'm talking about racism in aged care in particular, um, we often tend to think about race as a one-way street. That is, that we have a majority population in the Australian context is typically a white Anglo-Australian population, and they are racist or discriminatory towards people of color from other backgrounds. Um, Obviously, that is not the way racism works in practice. I really want to emphasize that. And that is really much more how we should think about racism when we're talking about it in aged care. And it is not a one-way street. It is not confined to one particular community or group. It is far more intersectional and cross-cutting. And multicultural communities can be indeed very racist and prejudicial towards each other as well. Now, in Australia, before we get into aged care, I think let's just set the context a little bit here. In Australia, we've got a very ignominious history when it comes to race relations. I guess it's most clearly articulated and understood in relation to the general community's relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and how we have historically treated Indigenous communities. And certainly that has dominated a lot of the discussion around racism in Australia. But when we look back through history and for the last 100 years, we can see that many communities, when they initially, especially migrant communities, when they arrived, were the subject of racism and prejudice. And then over time, as they continued to, I guess, acculturate and sort of live within Australian communities and societies, became absorbed more and more as part of the kind of broader community, general community, and then, then newer waves of migrant communities have then become the subject of vilification. So, for example, if we think about Italian and Greek communities post-World War II, were the subject of considerable amounts of racism and discrimination when they arrived, and then that has eventually changed over time. Other communities, such as Vietnamese communities, have endured and indeed continue to endure a great deal of racism, even though they have been in Australia for a very long time. And similarly, so to the Chinese communities, which have in fact been in Australia for over 100 years, but have and do in many instances continue to be to experience discrimination and racism. Now, the reality is Australia is a multicultural nation, and we've had multiculturalism and immigration into Australia for over 100 years now. And it has been absolutely crucial to this country's economic performance and economic sustainability, and indeed, in some cases, survival. However, that said, there is a tension between the need for migration to actually sustain and grow the economy and sustain and grow the country versus the kind of rhetoric that we see espoused in the media and among some of our politicians, and kind of framing that rhetoric and sort of tilting the community sentiments towards lower rates of immigration intake. We only have to look at some of the current debates around housing, or international students, or student caps, or climate change, or sustainability, to see how this rhetoric bubbles to the surface very, very quickly. Immigration can become a very quick and easy scapegoat for lots of societal problems like housing, urban sprawl, traffic congestion, unemployment, crime, et cetera, et cetera. And but I really want to emphasize it's a scapegoat. Right? The presence of someone like me who is a migrant is not why there is no housing. It's because there was no government investment in housing for 30 years. So we have to be very careful about how we scapegoat people and how we target and vilify communities, which becomes a veneer for actually a lack of government action over many, many years and policy failures. So within this kind of bigger picture context, racism in aged care also occurs. And when I talk about racism in aged care, I'm not talking about racism that is directed only to Aboriginal aged care workers. I'm actually talking about the racism that is directed to the vast majority of the aged care workforce, which are migrant aged care workers, which are now about 57% of the aged care workforce, particularly frontline staff. And we know there's not a lot of literature around, but we have done some research in this space, and we know that staff face a lot of prejudice on the basis of their skin color, their accented English, and even some of their cultural approaches to care provision. This is not necessarily a uniquely Australian issue. We've had a look around the world in many other similar countries, and it has certainly cropped up in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in Europe, and in other places as well. Now, racism has a lot of consequences on people, and I think, and on staff. And I think I'm not going to elaborate too much on its impacts on the staff, because I know Gail's going to talk about that a lot more. But what I want to, I guess, reinforce is that the biggest consequence on staff is people leave. People don't complain. They endure for as long as they can, and then they leave. And if we think about the pressures that we are facing in the system, the shortage of staff, the need for continuity of care, this is a very big threat to how we consider sustainable aged care and good quality aged care. When staff are experiencing racism, then likewise, if it undermines the quality of care, then abuse and neglect is also more likely. So is the inappropriate use of restraints, unreported assaults, and people in extreme pain at the end of life not receiving good quality care. And of course, that affects organizations and their capacity to innovate, their capacity to hold on to good staff, and also, let's face it, their capacity to retain their market share and retain a profit as well. So all of these things have negative consequences. In the few minutes that I have left, let me just talk about a couple of solutions, which I think are important. Again, I just want to emphasize that this is at an individual level. So the first thing I want to say is we are an aging and multicultural nation. This is our reality. It is not something that we can escape, and therefore we must look at the strengths that we have in the workforce. So I've talked about the composition of the aged care workforce already, that it's about over 51% in residential aged care working from a migrant background. And I want to talk about some of the things that we can offer. So as our country becomes more multicultural and older, there is an opportunity for culture matching, right? So where that is older people from the same culture as the staff can come together. They may speak different languages. They may have common cultural foundations. They can build trust and rapport. They can assist with navigation, and they can help to combat some of the stigma of conditions within aged care, like dementia, for example. We did some research, and we found that migrant aged care workers really function as boundary crossers. They can help with support emotional engagement. They can help educate their communities, negotiate in terms of how health and aged care systems work, navigate those systems, advocate on behalf of their clients, and solve problems in a very creative way. This work's often invisible and unpaid, but it is really critical work that's possible. I'll skip this bit of the slide because I've only got a minute left, and I'll go a bit faster. It's not always possible to culturally match, but when that is not possible, we know from the evidence that continuity of care, rapport, and feeling listened to is what's really important to families and older people themselves. What works at a personal level is very much around reciprocity, respect, using your body language, remaining open, using the physical environment, and engaging with people in a meaningful way as much as possible. I do want to emphasize that I've talked about things at a very individual level, but there is a lot that has to be done at a systems level and at an organizational level. I know Gail's going to elaborate on that a little bit more, and I can certainly talk about it more in the Q&A as well. So on that, I'm going to finish off and summarize some of the foundations for success. One is that when we talk about reciprocity, friendship and a familiar-like relationship between migrant care workers and care recipients is very helpful to combat racism. Harnessing migrant care workers' perception of care work, because often it's seen as skinning work and work that you do as in respect, and it's imbued with a lot of moral value. Organization and government recognition of the care and role that migrant workers actually perform within our care economy is also a foundation for success. Mutual respect. At the end of the day, if you can't have friendship, you can have respect, and that's good enough in this instance. And finally, you need organizational support, but I'm not going to elaborate on that too much because I'll hand over to Gail to talk about that as well. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions, I think, after Gail. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak.
Gail entered the aged care career pathways in 2017 as a dementia care coordinator for MCCI, and then moved to TAFE, New South Wales, under the Aging Home and Leisure stream as an education support. Returning to MCCI in 2022, Gail continues her passion as an advocate for person-centered care, in particular care for older, culturally and linguistically diverse people. Gail remains at TAFE as a part-time teacher, supporting students undertaking Certificate 3 in aged care. Gail has a diploma in dementia care and Certificate 4 in training and assessment. And today she's here to help us discuss racism. Thank you, Gail, for coming.
I'm going to talk about diverse workforce, which is the topic of our new research, or not research, it's actually a resource booklet. Through this presentation, I'm going to tell you how we came about that resource and what the findings were. What we wanted to find out is what are the challenges and what are the issues that we've got when it comes to racism and discrimination in the workforce. So after seeing many different presentations on racism, particularly Bianca's, finding out information myself through our training, because we do deliver training to aged care workers throughout New South Wales and ACT, and also in my role in an RTO, I'm hearing information about barriers and challenges there might be for people, particularly from a core background, culturally and linguistically diverse background. And I want to make sure, is what I'm hearing right? Is what we're hearing? What do we need to do about it? So we asked a couple of questions. We did a bit of research. We actually sent out a survey to find out some information. And based on all of that, what we did was created a resource. So we talked first about what the challenges were in a diverse workforce. But firstly, like Bianca said, having a diverse workforce means that there's a lot of positive things. There's enrichment culture experiences, there's cultural sensitivity, there's engagement and navigation for their communities, for people where they're from, the same core background that they might be from. And there's a difference in holistic care and support for older people when you're looking for people from diverse workforces. But what we know is that when we're having a look at the great things, we need to have a look at some challenges that might need to be overcome. So a couple of the challenges that we know are around in aged care, especially with diverse workforces, is there might be unconscious bias or a lack of awareness within community. There's effective trauma within different clients or staff that might affect what happens within the workforce. There's training and development gaps. We know that that's the same, because what we hear when we're delivering training is that people want more training within a cultural workforce or workplace. And there's a workplace culture that we know that most workplaces have, and sometimes it's not the best culture. So we need to work on that. One of the questions in our survey was, have you experienced or witnessed racism or discrimination in your workplace? Now, 38.15% said that they'd witnessed it, and 29% that said that they'd experienced it. So when we got the results back, what we found was that there was 332 people that actually responded to the survey. Now, originally I thought 332 was not a lot, but then when I thought about it, that's 332 individual people who either experienced it, witnessed it, or know that there's racism and discrimination within their aged care workforce. So to me, that's 332 too many. So of those, we had 94 people that had experienced racism and discrimination, which means it's just too many, and we need to try and work really hard about how we can stop that within the culture, within our workforce for aged care. So when we asked how often have you or your colleague experienced racism or discrimination in the past 12 months, what we saw was pretty similar to what your statistics were coming back. It only happens sometimes, or it might be just at night shift or something like that. And what we were seeing that even if it is once or twice, it's too many times. So 13% say that they're experiencing or witnessing racism and discrimination daily, then the impact is extremely great. We asked them how it made them feel, and we allowed them to actually use one word or two words when they were saying, how does this make you feel? So for people to look at the screen, if you have a look at those words, what you can see is that they're more than just, I'm upset about experiencing racism or discrimination. It's more about really deep feelings that people who set foot inside their workplace every day feel. So just place yourself in that situation and think, every time I come in my workplace, am I going to have these feelings? Is this what it's like? And as we know, when there's racism and discrimination, you don't leave it at the door when you go home. You take that with you. And so there might be incidences of trauma when they're taking it with them at home. And then that has a flow-on effect to their mental health. And as Bianca said, when you've got very low willingness to work, when you're sad about working, when you feel unsafe in your workplace, 9 times out of 10 you'll leave. So that workforce in aged care that we so desperately need is really at risk because we're not making sure that everyone feels safe. So we have to break it up a little bit because we know there could be racism coming from different levels. So what if the comments are coming from a resident or client? Now, we had a large amount of people that were telling us that this was the case, especially for our called workforce, people of a different skin colour, different language. They were saying that they were experiencing racism from their clients. And some of the things that they were telling us was that there was name calling, that some clients refused to be looked after because of who they were or how they spoke. And often we found that, especially when there's cognitive decline or if someone is living with dementia, that sometimes those comments may be the unfiltered comments that would come out. And we have to have a look at that and how we can actually negotiate that. So for people that have full cognitive abilities, we need to be able to think, how can we actually change the way that they think or what they actually do? Is it unconscious bias? Is that the reason why they're calling people out? Is there some trauma from that person as well? As we know, people with backgrounds that have lived in Australia may have experienced trauma themselves. They may have experienced war where they went off to fight war. And so they have those biases already. Sometimes it's just what you're brought up with, and those things have never been challenged. Your biases or your comments have never been challenged. There's other not compense. There's other levels to this. It could be that the person you're caring for has religious needs, or there's a cultural background where they can't have someone of a different sex looking after them. So we need to consider that as well. So what we did was we thought about, how do we take action if this is happening? What do we need to do to be able to support our clients, but also support our staff, our colleagues? So we need to understand the history of the resident or client, which is really important. We all know that. We need to understand it because that's how we negotiate around what our clients are saying or how they're behaving. Be a champion for your client, for your colleagues. So if your colleague is in the line of fire from a client where there's actual racism and discrimination, we need to be able to stand up for our colleagues. And in the book, there's different ways you can do that. And when I say the book, it's the resource that I'll show. So managers and executives have got a huge responsibility as far as making everything safe for their clients and the worker, making sure that our clients have got a say. So have a reference group for residents and clients. And the board also has a really big role to play here to make sure that their managers are supported to give training to not only their staff but to their clients as well. So what if the comments are coming from our colleagues, so the people we work with every day? What if they're the ones that are actually being racist or discriminative? And we know that this happens. And it's not just where there's called workers. It can also be if you've got a specific organisation, so a culturally specific organisation. There may be people that are engaged in employment that may be in the minority, and then that and in turn show some forms of discrimination. And we certainly had that feedback from some people that were telling us about how they felt as maybe a European or an English person, not English, an Australian person in an organisation, and they felt like that they were being discriminated against. So what we looked at is, what does it mean when we have the culture in our workplace? So every workplace has a culture. And what we want to ask people is it the type of culture that you want? So you directly contributing to a good culture, an inclusive culture, a culture where people belong. And that's not only your clients, that's obviously your colleagues. And we also always ask, who's responsible for that safe workplace? And a lot of people come back to us and say it's our managers or the board that might be responsible. But in actual fact, it's every single one of us in the workplace that's responsible, from our frontline staff to our administrative staff, HR, to our team leaders and to our board. We're all responsible for that safe cultural workplace. When it was discussed about staff towards other staff, some of the language that was used was really quite strong. Some of it was really quite difficult to read because you could see the emotion in a lot of the people's responses. We got a lot of responses where they said they had to leave, and they actually changed their vocation. So they got out of aged care altogether and they went and worked somewhere else, which is, like I said, really detrimental to the organisations that they left, because we need to keep our staff. But you can see here in comment number 2, there was a CEO that made a derogative term. So when we're talking about lead by example, we need to lead by example because people are watching what's happening from our managers. They need to really make sure that they're doing the right thing for safety and inclusion. Staff making fun of accents and food. And of course, throughout this, we always saw staff talking on the floor in their native language, and then we saw staff talking in their kitchens or in the staff rooms in their native language. And they thought that that was a form of discrimination. So that was another topic that we wanted to explore and have a look at. But we can see that when we're having a look at some of these responses, that a lot of it could be unconscious bias. So people need to be challenged about the way they think. Sometimes we all have those thoughts that go through our mind, and we need to have a challenge about what that's from, whether it's from our colleagues, whether it's something that we grew up with our family or friends, or whether or not it's something that we've seen on the media to make us think that way. We need to be able to challenge that bias and see what we can do with it. When we want to take action for people that are in the workforce, so this is action for people to talk about with their colleagues. We had the frontline workers. We want to make sure that they challenge racism and discrimination. And we know that that can be really hard because being an active bystander, as apart from a bystander, is very challenging itself. So whether you feel safe enough to speak up, whether you can interject, or whether it's just that you go to your manager to say, I've just witnessed this and I think something should be done. We need to document it. We need to do something about it. But we always need to support the person who's experiencing that racism and discrimination. So we need to be champions for our colleagues. We need to understand policy and procedure. So it's very important. And I did see on that poll that someone said, I'm not sure what we're doing about racism, whether or not there's a policy and procedure in place for bullying or racism within the workplace. Certainly what the procedure would be if you experience it or witness it. What do I need to do? What forms do I need to fill in? Who do I need to talk to? And how do I get this actioned? So for managers and executives, they need to understand their workforce. And that can mean that they need to understand it both from a HR perspective, a hiring perspective, or understanding what the complexities within their workforce might be like. So whether or not it's actually chatting with people, making sure that you have a diversity and inclusion meeting group with different staff members from different levels to make sure that you capture that information. So understanding who your people are. And for the boards, promote diverse leadership. Now, that's very important. Throughout this survey, we also had people saying that they'd been looked over for having a higher duties because it was assumed that they couldn't do it because English was their second language. So we also need to promote diverse leaderships where it's warranted. Obviously, it's got to be on merit, and it should be on merit always, but that's something that we need to look at. And have robust staff engagement reviews. So make sure that the reviews the staff are giving us are anonymous, absolutely anonymous, and that they can be free to be able to say what they want. Would work towards a really good culture. When we're talking about communication, one of the things that we always get to talk about with the people that we train, people from aged care in the aged care workforce, like I said, throughout New South Wales and ACT, what they say is they're always curious about what they can ask people from different backgrounds that they work with. So what we found is that instead of just saying, where are you from, we can base our communication on different things. Great accent, or tell me about your name. Where does it come from? Tell me something you love about where you're from. I've always been fascinated by languages. How do you say hello in a certain language? Ask about the food. What's your favourite food? Mine's something. What's yours? So these conversations need to be approached with curiosity and respect. So when we're training, we always talk about cultural intelligence, which is where we build intelligence about different cultures. We continually learn. And the best way we can learn about different cultures is to talk to our colleagues. They'll be able to tell us all sorts of things about the people that we care for, what's important to them, what might be important for us to know as well. So it's really important that we use the people that we work with to find out this information, this knowledge that'll help us be better carers as well. So from all of this information, what we did was we built a resource. It's called the Diverse Workforce, and that's it there. We've got a little QR code. It's on our website, and what you can do is you can actually download it as an electronic resource. And within this resource, there's a lot more information about some of the questions that we asked, some of the responses that we received, certainly some of the actions that we think you can take. And there's also some links to some other resources that might support you. So what we want to do is be able to spark that conversation. And as Bianca's shown, there's an elephant in the room. We need to discuss the elephant in the room because with all the training and education that we've supported, we understand that this is a huge topic because it is throughout a lot of organisations, and we need to do better with this. We need to be able to work out what we can do. So feel free to jump on that website and on our MCCI website and download the resource, the electronic resource. So our key points here is to approach situations with respect, awareness and inclusion. So awareness about who your colleagues are, make sure that they're included, but also make sure that they feel like they belong in the organisation. And that goes for all cultures. Cultural intelligence, I just spoke about that, and that's how we build that cultural intelligence, by understanding who we're looking after. And I think we do that really well because we always have things like life history or my life story, but do we understand the people that we work with? Bianca said that we don't have to be friends, but we have to be colleagues and we have to be very respectful. So be the change. Make sure if you're seeing it, you're witnessing it, that you can change that culture within your community, which is very, very important. So your workforce community needs to be somewhere where you enjoy going. Even if it's a tough job, which aged care is, you can actually have people surrounding you that you're happy to be there, and show no tolerance for discrimination and racism. So that's where we need to all be active bystanders. So I just love this quote: inclusion's not bringing people into what already exists, it's making a new space, a better space for everyone. And I think that really does hit home when we think about what sort of culture, what sort of workplace culture do we want? And I think that's a perfect one. We're making space for everyone. Very important.
Where can aged care workers go? What sort of support is available for them if they experience racism?
Ideally, they should be able to go to their line managers. You need a robust framework and a bit of a roadmap within an organization for how these things are going to be documented and responded to, and what the organization's threshold is really in response to that particular instance of prejudice and discrimination, and whether that's it's a one and done, or whether it's a three strikes and you're out, or how it gets articulated. But we really do need an organization needs a very clear roadmap for how they manage it.
I was wondering how you see the link between trauma experienced by staff and any support they need if they experience racism.
Trauma manifests in many ways. So you might have clients who have experienced trauma in their past life. And the common analogy that I've heard a lot is actually from the Vietnam War, where, some older people who have been Vietnam War veterans, and then they have a Vietnamese person come to the house to provide aged care. And especially if they've got some sort of dementia or cognitive impairment, then this can be quite confronting. But in turn, I think trauma is not an excuse to behave badly. And it is not a reason to inflict trauma on other people. And so we have to find ways to support the workforce. And when these kind of interactions happen, I think that slide Gail put up where she described how people felt about being vilified and discriminated. They're pretty heavy words, No one said, oh, I felt bad. People were using very heavy emotive language. So it does have an impact and a residual impact, and it has a health impact as well. And as I've talked about, an economic one too. So it's not just a nice thing to do. It is a extraordinarily sustainable thing to do for the entire sector to look after the workforce and mitigate the effects of that trauma. And I think the very first step in that is having clear policies and procedures in place. And then the second step to that is obviously not having racism to begin with. But, if it is there, really driving home the need for respectful relations.
I also have a question in the chat, and that's a question that comes up actually quite often, and that is how to deal with aggressive residents as an aged care provider, or racism that comes from clients or residents.
If someone is living with dementia and you're experiencing racism from that person, it's very difficult to re-educate that person, or to provide some sort of education or training, or even interrupt, because we know that sort of confrontation isn't really good. The best thing you can do there is redirect or distract, and make sure that you're really supporting the worker. For someone who has cognitive ability that doesn't have a diagnosis of dementia, I don't see any concerns with making sure that that person has information about how diverse we are, the workforce that we've got, the reason why these people are, why people from culturally and linguistically diverse people are here supporting us, and also making sure that they understand the human side of care and the people that are there. I remember seeing this survey, or it wasn't a survey, it was actually a controlled study, where care workers actually wore a brooch that said, I'm a mother, or I have children, or I'm a daughter, or something else that had a relatable context where they could then share that with the client, and I think, or the resident. And I think something like that's really important for aged care service providers to look at, to then to be able to provide support for their staff firstly, and also to try and make sure that they can inform their clients of how wonderful these people are that are caring for them.
For one more last question, which we have in the chat box. So we got a good feedback about the presentation. So thank you, Bianca and Gail. I've worked in large hospitals and have had many conversations with staff from diverse backgrounds who also report discrimination, feel like they're not seen for senior positions. Now, the question is, how can we encourage organizations to employ diverse workforce with diversity in their leadership?
It's a fabulous question. Can I just say that? And it is an area we need so much more work, because in fact, and this is an issue not just in health and aged care, but across many sectors of the Australian workforce, where the more senior you go, the less diverse the leadership teams become. And that actually is, in my opinion, very dangerous, because you end up with very ossified thinking, and you end up with thinking that occurs in a cocoon, right? Because, if no one's ever experienced racism or discrimination or vilification or anything bad's ever happened to them in their life, how on earth are they going to possibly correlate with their staff who are experiencing this on an everyday basis? So having that diversity at a senior level is really crucial. It's crucial not only for that different experience, but it's also crucial for understanding different thinkings and different paradigms of how we approach care. So let's just take aged care as an example. So I use this one a lot. So I'm from India. Now, in India, there's no word for dementia in Hindi, right? But there's over 40 words for care. So that tells you something about that linguistic and cultural framework, that they may not have a correlation for illness condition, but there is a whole kind of rhetoric around care. And those are different understandings and ideas of care that can shape how we deliver care today. 333% increase in South Asian aged care workers in Australia over the last 10 years. So we absolutely must have that kind of diversity reflected in our senior leadership, as well as our frontline staff, if we are ultimately to deliver care to what is also an aging and multicultural population. So fantastic question.
I would like to thank everybody for the interest in our topics, for being with us in this year, and we would like to see you in next year as well. We hope you have a good end of the year.